Could you describe to us some of the findings? I know you've done some research on tuition, and you were looking across Canada at different tuition levels and basically kind of this changing of how universities are funded.
Yep.
Could you describe this kind of process? And I know your research covers between 1993 and 2012. Could you tell us about the trends in funding education through those times?
We started looking at post-secondary education and tuition fees, particularly in universities, about 4 years ago, and have done a series of reports to look at where, if current trends continue, we can expect tuition fees to be in that current fall, and then projecting forward 4 years, tuition fees and other compulsory fees, because of course there's still fees you have to pay even if they're not tuition fees, and of course compulsory fees are often far less regulated than tuition fees themselves are. So in order to provide a bit of background, we looked at how this trend had started, or at least when it started to accelerate. And certainly from 92, say to 2012, we've seen a massive withdrawal in the amount of public funding that goes towards university operating revenue, and right across the country, more in some provinces than in others, but it's still a fairly striking reduction, and a corresponding increase in the amount of university operating revenue that comes from tuition fees. So how much of the responsibility for funding post-secondary education has shifted from governments onto students and their families in the form of tuition fees increasing. Again, this isn't entirely across the board. There have been some fairly striking exceptions to this rule, but by and large, what it has meant is that since about 93-94, tuition fees and other compulsory fees have effectively tripled on average across the country.
And what has this done to the quality of education?
Well, what it's done is it's made it far less public, first of all, again, depending on the province in which you live. And it's also resulted in just a real deficit in funding that goes towards just basic maintenance and upkeep of the school. We have a multi-billion-dollar deficit in deferred maintenance, much of which is actually required immediately, just to bring schools back up to the point where you don't try to hammer something into a wall and a big chunk of wall falls down. We've also seen, for example, universities who are both victims of this sort of cutback agenda, this austerity agenda, but also perpetrators of it, move towards a system where they are looking to compensate for a lack of sufficient public funding by taking it out of students in the form of additional compulsory fees, which can be added to, so you have fee on top of fee on top of fee. And there's very little, there is some move to regulate this, but not a lot, to moving towards hiring, instead of full-time professors and full-time educators, contract faculty who can be hired at much lower cost and in fact are barely, in some cases, making above poverty wages, if that. And we're just looking at far fewer investments in post-secondary education for where that core funding is required, and in addition to which, going more and more to the private sector to get more corporate donations, bequests, going after wealthy alumni to actually get more of that private targeted funding, which has done nothing to reduce tuition fees and make education more accessible for students across the board.
So here's an argument that's been made by students, especially in Quebec, is that we actually need user fees, and it's up to the individual to pay for their education, and they're basically paying for their value. How would you address that?
I absolutely agree that we should pay for education. I believe that we should pay fully and for the full cost. I don't think that it's ever been an issue that students don't want to pay for their education. I think the debate is when they pay for it and how they pay for it. Do you pay for it publicly through the tax system, which of course ensures that you graduate, you get a job, you pay more in taxes, it goes back into the general pot, and we fund those social programs, universities, colleges, schools, hospitals, that everybody benefits from collectively? Or do we download it onto individuals, force them to pay for it privately, which can mean that some individuals, the lower income and middle income individuals, have to take on significant debt loads in order to do so, and then have to pay it back again through the public system, because the public tax system, because of course they're still going to do that, but then also pay for it privately. So it's not a question of nobody wanting to pay their fair share, it's just whether or not people should pay for it twice, depending on when they can pay for it, whether or not they can bear the interest that's going to be charged if you can't pay it off immediately, because your parents aren't wealthy enough or you're not independently wealthy enough, or do we actually share the risk and all of us share in the benefit of a generation graduating with a degree and not deeply in debt as a result of that degree.
People in Quebec have said, or even statistics show, that Quebec actually pays less tuition than most other provinces in Canada. So some of the arguments that are brought forward is that Quebec doesn't pay its fair share. And I'm wondering if you could address that.
First of all, it is true that Quebec has low tuition fees for in-province students. It's about 3 times more if you go to university in Quebec and you're from outside of Quebec. Actually, when additional compulsory fees are factored in, Quebec does not have the lowest fees. It is Newfoundland and Labrador that has the lowest fees now. And it bears mentioning that they have embraced low tuition fees on a universal basis. They do not have a 2-tier structure as Quebec and a number of other provinces have moved towards. I would argue that students in Quebec do pay their fair share. They have just opted through low tuition fees to pay their fair share through the public system. Again, I think we need to remember that when tuition fees are high, students are going to be pay back the cost of their education through the public system and then paying it back again in the form of the private debt that they have incurred as a result of user fees or tuition fees being downloaded onto them.
So what would you consider then the most ideal model for universities to receive funding?
Oh, definitely through the public system. It's the most equitable, the most efficient, the fairest way, and it also ensures that all students benefit, and that we all share in the risks and in the rewards, because it is true that depending on the income or the salary that you're going to make after you graduate from university, and of course this also just assumes or presumes that the only reason you go to university is to get a job and then to pay more in taxes, which is of course not the case. We all benefit from living in a highly educated society that's not deeply indebted as a result. We know that statistically, if you have access to post-secondary education, you're more likely to be civically engaged, you're more involved in your community. If you're a parent, you tend to read more to your children, you tend to be healthier. I mean, these are all the things that come as a result of living in an educated society, and we all benefit from that. There are, of course, economic returns to the investment we make in our post-secondary education and ensuring that students have access to that education system. But not all students are going to benefit in a private market the same way. Some students are going to make more, some students are going to make less. And if we only judge education based on how much money you make when you graduate, we're going to be missing out on all the nuances of a well-rounded society that really appreciates and benefits from artists and librarians and childcare workers who don't necessarily make the salaries that doctors and architects and engineers make. So I think it's really important to recognize that this is about creating a well-educated and well-rounded society, not just graduating people who are going to make the greatest amount of money, although that does factor into the economic returns as well.